Somebody's broken into my house and my wife has been shot.
Stay on the line for the ambulance, sir. We have a shooting victim. Go ahead, sir.
I just walked in. My wife, I believe she's been shot. It's got blood everywhere.
Okay, sir. Is she breathing?
Her brain is on the floor. I think she's already dead. She's 8 months pregnant.
Okay, sweetie. Just stay on the phone with me, okay?
David Temple was not just any high school football coach. He was a pillar of the Katy, Texas community. His commitment to his team and his influential role within the local high school made him a respected figure. David's life seemed picture-perfect, married to Belinda Temple, who was equally cherished as a special education teacher at Katy High School. Together, they embodied the ideal suburban family, living in a comfortable home in a well-regarded neighborhood. Belinda was the kind of teacher who left a lasting impression on her students and colleagues alike, known for her compassion and dedication to her work. Their son, Evan, was the center of their world, and the couple eagerly anticipated the arrival of their second child, a baby girl, in just a few short weeks. But the facade of their idyllic life was shattered on January 11th, 1999. That day, David returned home with their 3-year-old son to a scene that would haunt him forever. His wife brutally murdered, her life violently ended in the very home they had built together. Belinda was discovered in their master bedroom closet, shot in the back of the head with a shotgun, in what appeared to be an execution-style killing. The method of the murder was chillingly intimate, suggesting a crime of deep personal motive. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Initially, the scene seemed to indicate a burglary gone horribly wrong. Drawers were pulled open, belongings were strewn about, and a window had been broken, all pointing to a potential home invasion. However, as investigators combed through the evidence, doubts began to emerge. The disarray in the home felt superficial. Certain valuables were conspicuously untouched, and the pattern of disturbance did not align with what would typically be expected in a burglary. David's behavior following the discovery of his wife's body only intensified these suspicions. He appeared unnervingly calm for someone who had just lost his wife and unborn child in such a violent manner. His account of the day's events, where he claimed to have been out shopping and picking up food with Evan during the time of the murder, quickly came under scrutiny. The timeline he provided seemed inconsistent, and the fact that he had left the back door unlocked, a critical detail in the context of an alleged burglary, raised even more red flags for investigators. Despite these growing concerns, the investigation faced substantial hurdles. There was no direct evidence linking David to the murder, no smoking gun, so to speak. Without concrete proof, law enforcement found themselves at an impasse, unable to make an immediate arrest. This lack of direct evidence would leave the case cold for several years. However, the investigation would take a dramatic turn when the detectives uncovered a crucial detail. David Temple was having an affair with Heather Scott, a fellow educator at the high school where he worked as a football coach. This affair, which began in late 1998, several months before Belinda's death, quickly escalated, with David and Heather exchanging frequent phone calls and meeting in secret. David had confided in Heather about his growing dissatisfaction with his marriage to Belinda, expressing his unhappiness and even discussing the possibility of divorce. Heather, unaware of the full extent of David's troubled marriage, believed they were on the path to building a future together. This relationship became a critical element in the investigation, providing with a potential motive for murder. David might have wanted to eliminate Belinda to start a new life with Heather. The discovery of the affair shattered the public perception of David Temple. To the outside world, He and Belinda seemed to have a happy, stable marriage. Their relationship was seen as the epitome of suburban bliss, a model for others to aspire to. However, the revelation of David's infidelity painted a starkly different picture, one of a marriage riddled with dissatisfaction and deception. Friends and colleagues who had admired the couple were left in shock, struggling to reconcile the David they knew with the man now suspected of orchestrating his wife's murder. For investigators, the affair was the missing link that connected the dots. It explained the motive behind the crime and why David might have gone to such lengths to stage the burglary. The apparent ransacking of the house, which initially pointed to a break-in, now seemed like a deliberate attempt to divert attention away from David and onto an imaginary intruder. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and with this new information, authorities zeroed in on David Temple as the prime suspect in his wife's murder. During the years following Belinda Temple's tragic death, David Temple attempted to continue with his life, almost as if the murder had been a tragic accident with no immediate suspect. In 2001, just 2 years after the murder, David married Heather Scott, the very woman with whom he had been having an affair at the time of Belinda's death. This decision shocked many in the community, as it appeared that David was moving on from his wife's murder rather quickly. Heather, who had been a fellow teacher, now became David's partner in life, and together they began to build a new life, seemingly unfazed by the unresolved nature of Belinda's death. However, beneath the surface, the case was far from over. The Harris County Sheriff's Office never fully closed the investigation, and as more details came to light, particularly about David's affair with Heather, the focus shifted back to David as the prime suspect. The narrative that David might have killed Belinda to clear the way for his new life with Heather gained traction among investigators. As the investigation was reopened, detectives revisited every aspect of the crime scene, scrutinizing David's alibi and the theory that the burglary had been staged. They began to piece together a timeline that either supported or undermined David's version of events on the day of the murder. This involved meticulously reconstructing David's activities on January 11, 1999. He had claimed that he was running errands with Evan, their 3-year-old son, when the murder occurred. However, investigators found that the timeline David provided was riddled with discrepancies. The route he claimed to have taken and the amount of time he spent on these errands didn't align with the time frame in which Belinda's murder was believed to have taken place. For instance, the time it took him to pick up food and return home did not match the window during which the crime could have occurred. Furthermore, the fact that David had left the back door of the house unlocked, a critical detail considering the supposed burglary, seemed increasingly suspicious to investigators. This seemingly small detail began to loom large, as it contradicted typical behavior in a community concerned about safety, especially if a break-in had already occurred. In addition to the inconsistencies in David's story, detectives began to question the credibility of the burglary itself. The lack of evidence pointing to a typical break-in, such as the absence of significant items being stolen, added to their skepticism. The scene inside the house seemed to have been manipulated to look chaotic, but certain valuables, like jewelry, were conspicuously left untouched. The disorder appeared superficial, as though it had been deliberately created to mislead investigators rather than the result of a genuine break-in. The placement of items and the pattern of disturbance did not match what would typically be expected from a random burglary. For example, drawers were open, but the contents were not rifled through in a manner consistent with someone searching for valuables. This meticulous but ultimately flawed attempt to stage the scene raised red flags for investigators who were experienced in crime scene analysis. These doubts about the burglary, coupled with the knowledge of David's affair, led authorities to believe that they now had enough circumstantial evidence to move forward with charging David for the murder of his wife. It was a significant decision, as 5 years had passed since Belinda's death, and the case had garnered significant attention. In 2004, David Temple was arrested and formally charged with her murder, a development that marked a turning point in what had become one of the most talked-about cases in Harris County's history. David's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. For Belinda's family, it was a moment of bittersweet relief, a step toward justice, even if it had been long delayed. They had spent years living with the uncertainty of whether Belinda's killer would ever be held accountable. The arrest was a signal that their patience and persistence were finally paying off. However, for those who had known David, the arrest was bewildering. Reconciling the image of the devoted, successful coach and father with the cold-blooded murderer described by prosecutors was challenging. David Temple's trial began in 2007. The prosecution's case against him was primarily circumstantial, relying on the affair with Heather Scott as the motive and the inconsistencies in his account of the day Belinda was murdered. They argued that David had meticulously planned the murder, staging the crime scene to appear as a burglary gone wrong. The prosecution also pointed out that no significant items were stolen, which further supported their theory that the scene had been staged. In the courtroom, the prosecution detailed how David had the opportunity and the motive to commit the crime. They highlighted his affair with Heather Scott, presenting it as the primary reason David wanted Belinda out of the picture. Witnesses were called to testify about David's behavior in the days leading up to and following the murder, painting a picture of a man who was growing increasingly unhappy in his marriage and was desperate to start a new life. A key piece of evidence was the timeline of David's whereabouts on January 11, 1999. The prosecution argued that his alibi didn't hold up under scrutiny, with various elements of his story being either implausible or directly contradicted by other evidence. For instance, the time it took him to complete his errands didn't match the time frame he claimed, raising doubts about his version of events. David's defense team, on the other hand, focused on the lack of physical evidence directly linking him to the murder. They argued that the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and conjecture, without any definitive proof that David was the one who pulled the trigger. The defense also suggested alternative theories, including the possibility that an unknown intruder could have been responsible for Belinda's death. They pointed to the broken window as evidence that someone else might have entered the home, though this theory was heavily contested by the prosecution. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found David Temple guilty of murder on November 15, 2007. He was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was seen as a victory for Belinda's family, who had waited nearly a decade for justice. However, the legal battle was far from over, as David's defense team immediately began working on an appeal, citing several issues they believed had unfairly affected the outcome of the trial, particularly concerning prosecutorial misconduct. They claimed that key evidence had been withheld by the prosecution, which might have influenced the jury's decision. In 2012, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed to hear the case. After reviewing the evidence and trial procedures, the court determined that David had not received a fair trial. Specifically, the court found that the prosecution had failed to disclose critical exculpatory evidence, which could have pointed to other potential suspects, or at least introduced reasonable doubt regarding David's guilt. This evidence included witness statements and investigative leads that had been overlooked or deliberately withheld, raising serious concerns about the integrity of the original trial. In 2016, the court made a landmark decision to overturn David's conviction, citing a violation of his constitutional rights. The ruling was a substantial victory for David and his defense team, as it not only invalidated the life sentence he had been serving, but also offered a glimmer of hope that he might eventually be exonerated. However, this legal victory came at a high emotional cost for Belinda's family. They were now faced with the harrowing prospect of enduring another trial, reopening the wounds that had barely begun to heal after the first conviction. Following the overturned conviction, David was released on bond while awaiting a new trial. The years that followed were marked by intense legal wrangling, as both the prosecution and defense prepared for what would be one of the most closely watched retrials in recent history. By the time the retrial commenced in July 2019, the case had become a media spectacle, with both sides fiercely contesting every aspect of the evidence presented. The retrial was highly anticipated, not only as a second chance for the prosecution to secure a conviction, but also as an opportunity for the defense to dismantle the narrative that had been constructed during the original 2007 trial. The courtroom became a battleground, with witness testimonies being scrutinized to the smallest detail. The defense worked tirelessly to cast doubt on the prosecution's theory, pointing out gaps and inconsistencies that they argued had been glossed over in the previous trial. Belinda's family attended every day of the trial, their presence a constant reminder of the human toll behind the legal proceedings. On the other side, David's supporters also filled the courtroom, hoping for a different outcome this time around. The atmosphere was emotionally charged, with tensions running high as the trial progressed. Despite the defense's vigorous efforts, the jury ultimately found David Temple guilty of murder, once again in August 2019. However, the retrial ended in a surprising twist. While the jury convicted David, they could not reach a unanimous decision on the appropriate sentence. The jury was deadlocked on whether to impose a life sentence or a lesser penalty, leading the judge to declare a mistrial for the sentencing phase. This left David in a state of legal limbo, his ultimate fate unresolved. The case continued to drag on as David's final sentencing was delayed by a series of legal motions and complications arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic's impact on the court system caused significant delays, adding to the uncertainty and prolonging the emotional strain on all parties involved. It wasn't until April 2023, nearly a quarter century after Belinda's murder, that David Temple was finally sentenced to life in prison. This brought some closure to the long-running case, although questions and controversies surrounding the trial process persisted, leaving a shadow of doubt over the final outcome. As of now, David Temple remains in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The ramifications of his conviction have rippled through his personal life as well. His second wife, Heather Scott, who had initially stood by him, ultimately divorced him during his retrial in 2019. The years of legal battles, public scrutiny, and the reality of the charges against David placed an unbearable strain on their relationship. Heather's decision to distance herself from David as the legal proceedings dragged on reflected the immense personal cost of the case. The once hopeful future that David had envisioned with Heather crumbled under the weight of the accusations and the relentless pursuit of justice for Belinda Temple. The tragic story of David and Belinda Temple raises many questions that continue to haunt those who followed the case. Did justice truly prevail, or are there aspects of the case that were overlooked? Could David Temple have been innocent, or was the evidence against him strong enough to warrant his life sentence? What do you think about the jury's decision and the legal process that spanned over 2 decades? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more true crime stories. Your engagement helps us bring you more in-depth investigations into the most intriguing cases.